December 21st, 1945. In a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, one of World War II's most celebrated and controversial generals took his final breath. George Smith Patton, Jr., the man whose name had struck fear into the hearts of Nazi Germany, the commander who had led his Third Army across Europe in a blaze of glory, was dead at just 60 years old. The official cause? A tragic car accident followed by complications. But in the decades that followed, whispers of something far more sinister began to circulate. Was America's most famous general the victim of a routine traffic collision, or was he silenced by those who found his outspoken views too dangerous to tolerate? Today, we're diving deep into one of World War II's most enduring mysteries. We'll examine the facts, explore the theories, and try to separate truth from fiction in the strange case of General George S. Patton's death. To understand why conspiracy theories about Patton's death have persisted for nearly 8 decades, we first need to understand who George S. Patton was and why he mattered so much. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born in 1885 into a family with deep military roots. From childhood, he dreamed of military glory, and he pursued that dream with an intensity that would define his entire life. He attended the Virginia Military Institute briefly before transferring to West Point, where he graduated in 1909. Even in those early days, Patton stood out, not just for his military aptitude, but for his absolute conviction that he was destined for greatness. Patton saw action in World War I, commanding tanks in the newly formed Tank Corps. He was wounded in the Meuse-Argonne offensive but recovered and continued his military career through the interwar years. By the time World War II erupted, Patton had spent decades studying warfare, particularly the mobile, mechanized warfare that would come to define the conflict. When America entered World War II, Patton was ready. He first commanded U.S. troops in combat during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in French North Africa, in November 1942. His performance there was impressive enough to earn him command of the 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. But it was his leadership of the Third Army from August 1944 through the end of the war that would cement his legendary status. Patton's Third Army swept across France with breathtaking speed. His tanks drove deep into enemy territory, exploiting breakthroughs, encircling German forces, and maintaining an aggressive tempo that the enemy couldn't match. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Patton achieved what many thought impossible, rapidly pivoting his entire army 90 degrees north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. It was a masterpiece of military logistics and leadership. By the war's end, Patton's Third Army had advanced further and faster than any other Allied army in the European theater. They had captured over 750,000 enemy soldiers and inflicted devastating casualties on German forces. Patton himself had become a household name, not just in America, but around the world. His pearl-handled revolvers, his ivory-hilted cavalry saber, his highly polished helmet and riding boots all became iconic symbols of American military might. But Patton was also deeply controversial. His command style was aggressive to the point of recklessness. His language was profane, even by military standards. And his opinions, which he expressed freely and publicly, often landed him in hot water with his superiors and the press. For all his battlefield brilliance, George S. Patton was a public relations nightmare. Time and again throughout the war, his actions and words created scandals that threatened to derail his career and embarrass the Allied cause. The first major incident occurred in June 1943, just before the invasion of Sicily. In a speech to his troops, Patton made an illegal order that would have horrific consequences. He told his men to take no prisoners. Whether he meant this literally or was simply trying to motivate his troops with tough talk remains debated, but the result was clear. Following the capture of the Biscari airfield, American soldiers cold-bloodedly executed 73 Italian prisoners of war. 2 soldiers were court-martialed for these war crimes, but Patton's order had created an impossible situation for the Allied command. America's most famous general had effectively sanctioned murder. To protect both Patton's reputation and the image of the U.S. Army, the investigation into Patton's role was quietly dropped by order of General Omar Bradley, his superior officer. The entire affair was swept under the rug, but it wouldn't be the last time Patton's judgment would be called into question. Just weeks later came the incident that nearly ended Patton's career entirely, the infamous slapping incidents. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited an evacuation hospital in Sicily. There, he encountered a soldier suffering from what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but what was then called combat fatigue or shell shock. Patton, who had no patience for what he saw as cowardice, physically struck the man across the face. Incredibly, Patton repeated this behavior just days later at another hospital. When a private explained that he was there due to combat fatigue, Patton exploded. He called the soldier a coward and a disgrace, shouting that he ought to be lined up against a wall and shot. Patton then slapped him as well. News of these incidents eventually leaked to the press, creating a firestorm of controversy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was forced to reprimand Patton and make him apologize to the soldiers, the medical staff, and every division in the 7th Army. For a time, it looked like Patton's career was over. He was sidelined, given no command for the D-Day landings, and used instead as a decoy to fool the Germans about where the invasion would occur. In August 1944, Patton took command of the Third Army, and over the following months, he proved his worth on the battlefield again and again. Still, the controversies continued. In March 1945, with the war in Europe nearly won, Patton ordered what would become known as Task Force Baum, a raid deep behind enemy lines to liberate a prisoner of war camp at Heidelberg. The mission was a disaster. Of the 314 men who set out with 16 Sherman tanks and numerous other vehicles, only 35 men returned. The rest were killed or captured. The vehicles and tanks were all lost. What made this scandal particularly damaging was what emerged afterward. Patton's son-in-law, Colonel John Waters, was a prisoner at the camp. It appeared that Patton had authorized a poorly planned high-risk mission to rescue his own family member with no regard for the cost in American lives and equipment. It was a blatant abuse of power. Only the fact that Patton's Third Army was performing so brilliantly in the final push into Germany kept the incident from ending his career. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Patton expected to be transferred to the Pacific to command an army in the final campaign against Japan. He was, after all, America's most famous general, a proven combat leader with an unmatched record of success. But the transfer never came. Instead, after a brief trip home to Massachusetts in June 1945, where he gave speeches before massive crowds, including 20,000 people at an outdoor venue in Boston, Patton was ordered back to Germany. He was to serve as military governor of Bavaria, overseeing the occupation and denazification of the region. It was a terrible match. Patton, a man of action, was bored and restless in what was essentially an administrative role. Worse, his views on how to handle post-war Germany put him at odds with official U.S. policy and his superiors. Patton viewed the denazification process, the systematic effort to remove Nazi Party members from positions of influence and to re-educate the German population, as misguided and unimportant. In his view, the real threat to Europe wasn't defeated Germany, but the Soviet Union. As the early stages of the Cold War began to unfold, Patton became increasingly vocal about what he saw as the Soviet menace. He bitterly regretted having to hand over territory that his Third Army had liberated to Soviet control, as had been agreed upon by the Allied leaders. "We have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them," Patton said, but we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war." Patton's attitude toward the defeated Germans was another source of constant embarrassment. He famously stated that being a member of the SS meant no more in Germany than being a Democrat in America. When this remark was published, it created yet another media firestorm. How could America's military governor of Bavaria equate membership in an organization responsible for horrific war crimes with membership in a mainstream American political party? Patton also opposed the plan put forward by U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. for post-war Germany, which would have essentially turned Germany into an agricultural society by dismantling its industrial base. Patton believed such harsh treatment would be counterproductive and would push the Germans toward communism and Soviet influence. In late July 1945, Patton visited the ruins of Berlin. What he saw there affected him deeply. "Berlin gave me the blues," he wrote. "We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages, and all Europe will be communist." It's worth noting that Patton's views on race and his comments about various ethnic groups would be considered deeply offensive by today's standards. He made numerous remarks that bordered on or crossed into anti-Semitism, which aggravated certain sections of the U.S. press and public against him. By late 1945, Patton had become a massive liability. The press had turned against him. President Harry Truman didn't rate him highly, comparing him unfavorably to egotists like General Douglas MacArthur and even to General George Armstrong Custer, who had died at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Eisenhower, though he valued Patton's military abilities, was exhausted by the constant controversies. In October 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of his position as military governor and gave him command of the 15th Army, essentially a paper army engaged in writing the history of the war. Patton accepted the position, happy to be out of the denazification business, but he continued to vocally criticize U.S. policy toward Germany and the Soviets. What's particularly interesting is what we've learned in the decades since. Both American and Soviet intelligence agencies were tapping Patton's phone. They were that concerned about his behavior and his outspoken views. The question that conspiracy theorists would later ask was obvious. Were they concerned enough to want him silenced permanently? December 9, 1945, started as an ordinary day for General Patton. His chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, had invited him on a pheasant hunting trip near the town of Mannheim. It was a Sunday, cold and snowy, but Patton was always eager for outdoor activities. The hunting party consisted of 2 vehicles. Patton traveled in his 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car, an imposing vehicle befitting his rank. His driver was Private First Class Horace Woodring, a 19-year-old combat veteran who had driven for Patton before. General Gay accompanied Patton in the back seat. Ahead of them, a jeep driven by Sergeant Joseph Scruce carried the hunting rifles, food, and a hunting dog. The party left Patton's headquarters and headed toward the hunting grounds. Along the way, Patton ordered a stop at the Roman ruins at Saarburg. He had a deep interest in military history and loved visiting historical sites. After touring the ruins, they resumed their journey. Initially, Patton sat in the front passenger seat, wanting to warm his feet next to the heater. But at a military police checkpoint, they stopped to transfer the hunting dog from the jeep to the Cadillac, as the animal was suffering from the cold. At this point, Patton moved to his usual position in the right rear seat, with General Gay sitting to his left. With the jeep leading, the Cadillac followed along the N38 road toward the northern outskirts of Mannheim. At a railway level crossing, the jeep passed over, but the Cadillac had to wait for a train. This separated the 2 vehicles. After the train passed, Woodring pulled away and continued driving. Up ahead, about half a mile in the distance, he noticed 2 U.S. Army trucks pulled onto the side of the road. As they drew closer, one of the trucks, a 2.5-ton GMC 6x6, started moving toward them. What happened next occurred in seconds. As the truck was about to pass the Cadillac, it suddenly veered left, directly into the car's path. Woodring had no time to take evasive action. The Cadillac collided with the truck at approximately 20 miles per hour. It wasn't a high-speed crash by any means, but the consequences for Patton were catastrophic. He was thrown forward from his seat, striking a metal rail or partition behind the driver. The impact caused a severe injury to his head and neck. Blood poured from a laceration that extended from the bridge of his nose to the top of his head. Patton collapsed into General Gay's lap, conscious but unable to move. "My neck hurts," he said. "I think I'm paralyzed." Remarkably, both General Gay and driver Woodring were virtually uninjured. The truck's driver and his passengers also appeared to be fine. Woodring immediately flagged down the first vehicle he saw, which by extraordinary coincidence happened to be an Army ambulance. The medic, Sergeant Leroy Ogden, climbed into the Cadillac and managed to stop Patton's bleeding. Patton was then carefully transported to the 130th Station Hospital at Heidelberg, arriving about an hour after the crash. Meanwhile, military police arrived at the accident scene to investigate. The truck's driver was identified as Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson. His behavior struck Woodring and others as odd. Thompson seemed unconcerned about the accident, grinning constantly. Woodring suspected that Thompson and his two passengers might have been under the influence of alcohol. More curious still, Thompson was 50 miles from where he was supposed to be, apparently on some kind of unauthorized joyride. Two officers from the 808th Military Police Company interviewed everyone involved. Despite the suspicious circumstances, no charges were filed against anyone. The accident was classified as a routine fender bender, a minor traffic incident. At the hospital in Heidelberg, doctors quickly determined that Patton's condition was grave. He was paralyzed from the neck down, his cervical vertebrae severely dislocated. The injury was similar to what we would today call a broken neck, affecting the spinal cord in a way that cut off nerve signals to the rest of his body. Specialists were immediately flown in from America, along with Patton's wife, Beatrice. The general remained conscious and mentally alert, but trapped in a body that no longer responded to his commands. For a man like Patton, who had lived his entire life in motion, defined by action and physical courage, this must have been a special kind of torture. For about a week, doctors carefully monitored Patton's condition. Then, something remarkable happened. He began to improve. Some respiratory muscle movement returned. His doctors grew cautiously optimistic. They began making preparations to fly him back to the United States for further treatment and long-term care. There was even talk that he might eventually recover some degree of mobility. But on December 20th, 11 days after the accident, Patton's condition suddenly deteriorated. The next day, December 21st, 1945, he died. The official cause of death was listed as pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, both complications that can occur after severe spinal injuries due to the body's inability to regulate various systems properly. On Christmas Eve, 1945, in accordance with his wishes, George S. Patton was buried among the fallen soldiers of his beloved Third Army at the American Military Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg. He lies there still, one headstone among thousands, a general who chose to rest among the men he led into battle. For 3 decades after Patton's death, there was no suggestion of foul play. His death was accepted as what it appeared to be, a tragic accident that had befallen a great man. But in 1974, something changed. A British writer named Frederick Nolan published a novel called The Algonquin Project. It was a fictional thriller loosely inspired by Patton's death that dealt with a conspiracy to murder a famous American general. The book was later adapted into a 1978 film called Brass Target, which, by all accounts, wasn't particularly good. But these two works of fiction planted a seed in the public imagination. Then, in 1979, a former Office of Strategic Services operative named Douglas Bazata came forward with a sensational claim. Bazata, who was in financial difficulties at the time, alleged that he had been ordered by OSS Director Major General William Donovan to assassinate Patton in December 1945. According to Bazata's story, Patton had become too much of an embarrassment to the U.S. government with his anti-Soviet rhetoric and his criticism of American policy in Germany. The decision was made at the highest levels to silence him permanently, and Bazata was chosen to carry out the hit. On the surface, Bazata seemed like a credible source. He was a genuine war hero who had earned numerous decorations for his daring operations behind enemy lines during World War II. But when you examine his story closely, it falls apart. Bazata claimed that he had tampered with Patton's car earlier in the day, jamming a window open by 4 inches so that he could have a clear shot later. He said he used a special weapon that fired small projectiles, designed to look like injuries from a car crash rather than gunshot wounds. According to Bazata, he shot Patton in the neck just before the staged accident, and when Patton survived both the shooting and the crash, he was finished off in the hospital with poison that mimicked natural causes. The problem is that Bazata's story contradicts the documented timeline and witness statements from that day. Multiple people, including General Gay and Driver Woodring, were with Patton almost the entire time. There's no point at which Bazata could have tampered with the car or shot Patton without being seen. The injuries Patton sustained were entirely consistent with the type of car accident that occurred, and Bazata couldn't even provide basic details about his supposed assassination weapon, claiming he couldn't remember which country manufactured it. Nevertheless, the press loved the story. It combined a famous historical figure, Cold War intrigue, and a murder mystery. Bazata's claims were widely reported, often without the critical examination they deserved. Once Bazata's story entered the public consciousness, it took on a life of its own. The conspiracy theory was further fueled by a few suspicious details surrounding Patton's death. First, no autopsy was performed on Patton's body. Conspiracy theorists pointed to this as evidence of a cover-up. If Patton had been poisoned in the hospital, an autopsy would have revealed it. But the reason no autopsy was conducted is straightforward. It was considered a routine accident with a clear cause of death. There was no indication of foul play, so there was no reason for an autopsy. Second, some records pertaining to Patton's accident were later found to be missing from the National Archives. Again, conspiracy theorists saw this as evidence of government cover-up. The more mundane explanation is that record-keeping in the chaotic final months of World War II and its immediate aftermath was often incomplete, and documents sometimes got lost or misfiled over the decades. These details found their way into The Last Days of Patton, a 1981 book by Patton biographer Ladislas Farago. Since then, multiple books have been published elaborating on the alleged plot to murder Patton. Some have even introduced new theories, including the idea that Patton was killed not by American agents, but by the Soviet NKVD, the forerunner to the KGB. The Soviet theory argues that Stalin's intelligence services saw Patton as a potential threat who might lead American forces in a war against the Soviet Union. His vocal anti-Soviet views and his position as a military commander in occupied Germany made him a target. According to this theory, NKVD agents arranged the accident or finished Patton off in the hospital. It's certainly true that the Soviets were monitoring Patton closely. We know they tapped his phones, and Stalin's intelligence services had certainly assassinated people before. But again, there's no concrete evidence that they were involved in Patton's death. Let's step back and examine what we actually know, separating documented facts from speculation and fiction. Fact: Patton was a controversial figure whose outspoken views had made him unpopular with many in the American and Allied leadership by late 1945. Fact: Both American and Soviet intelligence agencies were monitoring Patton's communications. Fact: Patton died as a result of injuries sustained in a car accident on December 9, 1945. Fact: the truck driver, Robert Thompson, was behaving oddly after the accident and was far from where he was supposed to be. Now, here's what we don't have. We don't have any documentary evidence from American or Soviet archives indicating a plot to kill Patton. We don't have any credible testimony from participants in such a plot. Bazata's story is riddled with inconsistencies and contradicts the documented timeline. We don't have forensic evidence suggesting anything other than an accidental death. We don't have any witnesses who saw anything suspicious beyond Thompson's odd behavior, which could be explained by shock, intoxication, or simply being a strange person. The strongest argument for conspiracy is circumstantial. Patton had become a problem for the U.S. government, and his death conveniently solved that problem. But this is far from proof. Inconvenient people die in accidents all the time without conspiracy being involved. The strongest argument against conspiracy is the sheer difficulty of what would have been required. To stage an accident convincing enough to fool multiple witnesses, military police investigators, and medical professionals while ensuring Patton died but no one else was seriously injured would have required extraordinary planning and execution. And then everyone involved would have had to keep silent for decades, despite numerous investigations and inquiries. So why do conspiracy theories about Patton's death persist, even in the absence of solid evidence? There are several psychological and cultural factors at play. First, there's the simple fact that Patton was a larger-than-life figure. He had survived 4 years of the most brutal combat in human history, leading from the front, always in danger. He'd been in numerous close calls during the fighting. For such a man to die in a routine car accident in peacetime, just months after his greatest triumphs, seems anticlimactic. It doesn't fit the narrative arc we expect for heroes. When great figures die in ordinary ways, we often reach for extraordinary explanations because we can't accept the mundane. President John F. Kennedy was killed by a lone gunman with a mail-order rifle, but millions prefer to believe in elaborate conspiracies. Princess Diana died in a car crash caused by a drunk driver and lack of seatbelts, but conspiracy theories persist. It's somehow more comforting to believe that important people die for important reasons, killed by powerful forces, rather than accepting that they can fall victim to the same random accidents that claim ordinary lives. Second, Patton's own controversial nature feeds the conspiracy. He had made enemies. He'd been monitored by intelligence agencies. There were powerful people who would have been relieved by his death. This creates a plausible motive, even if there's no evidence of actual action. Third, the initial fictional accounts, Nolan's novel and the film Brass Target, provided a template for conspiracy theorists. They showed how it could have been done, even though they were explicitly fiction. Then Bazata's story, false though it was, gave the theory an apparent witness. Finally, there's the natural human tendency toward conspiracy thinking, especially regarding government actions. In an era when we know that governments have engaged in covert operations, surveillance, and even political assassinations, it doesn't seem implausible that they might have eliminated a troublesome general. The fact that some government records were missing only feeds this suspicion. So what's the verdict? Was General George S. Patton murdered, or did he die in a tragic accident? Based on the evidence available, the most reasonable conclusion is that Patton's death was indeed an accident, an unfortunate chain of circumstances that ended the life of one of America's most famous military commanders. The accident happened in broad daylight with multiple witnesses. The injuries Patton sustained were entirely consistent with the type of collision that occurred. His death 11 days later was from complications commonly associated with severe spinal injuries. There's no forensic evidence of poisoning or any other foul play. And despite decades of investigation by journalists, historians, and conspiracy theorists, no credible evidence of a murder plot has emerged. Could there have been a conspiracy? In the abstract, yes. We know that governments conduct covert operations. We know that Patton had made powerful enemies. We know he was being monitored. But could have is not the same as did. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in this case, the evidence simply isn't there. The most likely explanation is the simplest. Robert Thompson, the truck driver, was on an unauthorized joyride, possibly intoxicated. He made a careless turn directly into Patton's path. It was a moment of inattention or poor judgment that had catastrophic consequences. Patton, sitting in the back seat, was thrown forward into a metal partition, sustaining a severe spinal injury. He fought for nearly 2 weeks, but ultimately succumbed to complications. It's a tragic, almost banal end for a legendary warrior. But that's often how life works. The man who led armies across Europe, who survived years of combat, who faced down German panzers and crossed rivers under fire, was ultimately killed by a routine traffic accident. Perhaps that's why the conspiracy theories persist. We want Patton's death to be as dramatic and significant as his life. We want it to mean something, to be part of some grand scheme. But sometimes tragedy is just tragedy. Sometimes accidents are just accidents. And sometimes even the mightiest heroes fall to the most ordinary of causes. General George S. Patton deserved better than to die in a car crash just months after his greatest triumph. But the universe doesn't always give us what we deserve. And in the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary, we must accept that one of history's great military minds was taken not by a conspiracy, but by cruel chance. The conspiracy to kill Patton makes for a compelling story. But that's all it is, a story. The truth, as best we can determine it, is both simpler and sadder. On December 9, 1945, a truck driver made a careless turn, and history lost one of its giants. Thanks for watching.